Queen's official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am honored to rise for what is formally my maiden speech in this place in response to the address and reply to the speech from the throne. Let my first formal words on the Hansard record here be those of gratitude. Gratitude for the constituents who have invested in me their confidence as their representative in this chamber. Gratitude for those who helped with my election in Calgary Lougheed last December, the volunteers and many hundreds of people who contributed and participated in the democratic process. Respect, parenthetically, for my fellow candidates from other parties who offered themselves in that democratic process. Gratitude, of course, for my family, all members of whom have, in one way or another, like for all of us, helped to shape me as a person and given me my passion for public service. I think particularly of my paternal grandfather, Mart Kenney, who was Canada's best-known musician in the 1930s and 40s, and after, Mr. Speaker, was a household name as the leader of Canada's largest or best-known big band and dance band. He was also a passionate Canadian nationalist and really invested in me my own passion for public service. Gratitude for one of the former deans of this place, our friend Dave Rodney, my predecessor as the member of this Assembly for Calgary Lougheed, for his statesmanlike decision to give me an opportunity to seek election to the legislature to serve in the capacity as leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition. Members who know Dave know him to be a quintessential Albertan who personifies the hopefulness and optimism that has always characterized Alberta. I respect him greatly for his past public service and for having given me the opportunity to be the voice for the official opposition in this place. And finally, gratitude for the members of my caucus and for the members of my party for having confided in me their trust to be leader of the new United Conservative Party and consequently leader of the official opposition. Mr. Speaker, I am deeply grateful for that trust, and I will endeavor every day to discharge the serious obligations that come with this role in an honorable fashion. Mr. Speaker, let me begin with words of profound esteem for this institution, in which we are also privileged to serve. I join in that privilege now, and we should never forget. I counsel my fellow members as somebody with nearly 2 decades of parliamentary experience, never to take for granted the privilege of walking into this place. I quoted the late Right Honourable John Diefenbaker in my farewell remarks in the House of Commons in September of 2016, when he said at the beginning of his long and storied parliamentary career that when I first walked in to this chamber, he said, I was humbled. I looked around at this chamber that looks like a cathedral and wondered to myself, how in the world did I ever end up here? And he said, a few days later, I looked around myself and said, how did the rest of them end up here? I'm sure that will never happen, Mr. Speaker. And so, as I speak about the institution, let me begin by speaking about the people who inhabit it, all of us who are custodians of this institution and the customs that it incarnates, this great tradition of ordered liberty, the customs of free people, of which Parliament and its constituent chambers is the safeguard. Mr. Speaker, we are debating now the address and reply to the speech from the throne, which some might regard as an anachronistic tradition, but I regard as an essential symbolic reflection of our constitutional order, of our parliamentary democracy, of our constitutional monarchy. I'm proud to sit in a chamber which is where our gracious sovereign looks over us every day, and where her authority is symbolized in the mace that is before us. In a assembly which flies the proud flags of Canada and Alberta, but also the Royal Union flag, which reminds us every day as we approach this building, as we enter this chamber, that we are entering in to not just a sterile room, not merely some debating chamber, but a living institution with that has developed organically over centuries of struggle. An institution and values which we can never take for granted. The history of the development of Parliament going back to the 14th century in England is the gradual, halting, occasionally violent, but usually peaceful and organic development of free people finding their voice. It is no coincidence that the root word of parliament from the Norman French is parler. It is the place in which we speak. It is that chamber that initially placed checks and balances on the royal prerogative of the crown. But what is unique, one of the reasons why in the Westminster parliamentary tradition, in which we all participate here, one of the reasons that this tradition became the first and the oldest democratic tradition in the world is because there was a brilliant, delicate balance between order and liberty, between authority and democratic representation. There is that dynamic tension in the historic development of Parliament about which we should always be mindful, and the entire secular liturgy around the speech from the throne reminds us of that. As Her Honor Lieutenant Governor enters the chamber, she does so accompanied not only by our accomplished Sergeant-at-Arms, but by other representatives of martial authority, by her aide-de-camp, by leading members of Her Majesty's Canadian Armed Forces, by leading members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, all of whom are here, in a sense, representing the executive authority of the Crown, meeting with the people's representatives. So we should never regard these as anachronistic customs. They give living expression to 800 years of development of this institution. Let's remember that from time to time. And I think one way in which we can give practical expression of our collective esteem for this institution and what it represents, and in turn we can demonstrate our respect for the constituents, the Albertans who we represent in this place, is through a degree of civility in the way that we engage in our debates here. Now, Mr. Speaker, I will, of course, frequently allude to my experience and the privilege of serving in the Ottawa Parliament. And let me offer a mea culpa. There is no doubt that absolutely no doubt that in my 19-some years in that place, I said and did things that I regret, that were uncivil. I heckled. I made unnecessary noise. I'm sure I was a thorn in the side of your counterparts in the Federal House of Commons from time to time, Mr. Speaker. And so mea maxima culpa. However, Mr. Speaker, I now find myself in the privileged position of serving as leader of the opposition in this place. And that is why, upon meeting my colleagues here shortly after becoming elected to this chamber, I proposed that we try to raise the tone, raise the bar of our comportment in this place. Even if it's not reciprocated, we can control at least our own actions, Mr. Speaker. And I hope that in so doing, we have, as a caucus, decided to suspend the practice of thunderous desk thumping, which I think creates unnecessary disorder in this place and detracts from the quality of debate. As much as possible, we've tried to suspend the custom of heckling. Now, Mr. Speaker, I say these things knowing full well that parliamentary debate is not croquet. This is not a walk in the park on Sunday afternoon. This is where we resolve our differences peacefully, but often in a spirited way. And there should be clash. There should be occasionally partisanship, as long as that partisanship isn't mindless, Mr. Speaker. Partisanship simply means that we associate ourselves with other elected officials who broadly share our values, principles, and policies to assert those in an organized and collective way. That's how our parliamentary system is developed. This is sometimes derided, but I think something to be honored and celebrated. So yes, this is a partisan institution, a place where there is and should be clash and occasional discord. But surely that clash and debate can happen in a broader context of civility. And the parameters for that civility is the institution itself, and the customs that it incarnates. And so, Mr. Speaker, I hope that we as the official opposition, at least we've been doing our best of late, to demonstrate that respect for the institution and the people that we serve. As I've said, I am sure that I, perhaps even some of my colleagues here, will do and say things in this place that we regret. But at least we are trying to set for ourselves a higher standard. And I do invite members of all parties to join with us in that effort. Nobody here is holier than thou. But we are all here, regardless of our partisan affiliation, of our political philosophy, or personal background. We are all here, ultimately, I hope, as humble servants of the people and of our sovereign. And so, Mr. Speaker, that is my commitment to you, that as long as I stand in this place, I will try, at least, to respect the best traditions of this place. Mr. Speaker, that leads me to some words about the province and the people who we serve, and the country to which we are so proud to belong. I note with pride that this is, I believe, the only legislative assembly in Canada, out of the 14 assemblies, including the federal parliament, which displays all of the flags of the 10 provinces and 3 territories. A beautiful expression of the innate patriotism of Albertans. In some places, patriotism has gone out of fashion. There are some who suggest that to be patriotic is to be jingoistic, and that there cannot be a healthy patriotism, but rather it immediately passes into jingoistic nationalism. I don't agree, Mr. Speaker. Patriotism simply means love of country. And I think Albertans are, perhaps because of the natural kind of unpretentiousness of Alberta people, we're not afraid, we're not ashamed to be proud as Canadians. Even when we believe the Federation sometimes is not working for our best interests, the response to that of most Albertans is to work to improve or perfect the Federation rather than to undermine it or tear it apart. And that impulse, that love for Canada, for the dream of Canada as a great land of opportunity is reflected in those flags that surround us here. And so I speak not just as an Albertan, but as a Canadian first. You know, Mr. Speaker, regrettably, in the give and take of partisan rhetoric, I've found in the past 18 months members of different parties attacking me because I was born in Ontario, heaven forbid, and raised in Saskatchewan before moving here to Edmonton, Alberta, when I was, I think, 22 years of age. So I'm proud to have spent virtually my entire adult life in Alberta and over half of my life in this province. But, Mr. Speaker, I am proud as well to have been born in and lived in other parts of Canada. You know, one of the most remarkable features of this province's political culture is how welcoming it is. I have rarely found traces of xenophobia amongst Albertans. To the contrary, this is a province that welcomes newcomers from every part of Canada and all around the world. And the ethic of Alberta is simply this: we judge you not by where you came from, what your last name is, how you pray, or who you love, but we welcome you, we judge you based on how you treat others, how hard you work, how you contribute to your community. Mr. Speaker, Alberta, if there is one word that can characterize the culture of this province, it is meritocracy. It is a province where we judge people by their merit. And that is why newcomers, and I love this when I go through the Calgary Stampede Parade, as I have 19 times as an MP, and you see hundreds of thousands of people lining the streets, and huge, I think disproportionate numbers of apparently new Canadians. Canadians by choice and not chance. It always brings, it moves me when I go through that parade and I see little kids of African or Asian origin, Latin American origin, from all around the world who are participating in that parade, wearing their cowboy hats and their little cowboy boots. They're eager, their families are eager to become Albertan, to identify with the symbols that are rooted in our history. That is how welcoming this place is. We believe, Mr. Speaker, in the dream of unity in diversity. We Albertans don't believe that diversity is a strength in and of itself. We believe the strength lies in unity in our diversity, in sharing what's best about our cultural patrimonies and faiths and backgrounds, in a true and authentic pluralism. And that's how Alberta has always been. In fact, let me reflect on our history, Mr. Speaker. When I look at those families as I go through the Calgary Stampede Parade, I'm often able to identify which countries of origin people are from, and very often able to identify people who came to Canada as refugees. I know this because of my 5-year experience as the Federal Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, during which time I was honored to welcome over 1.2 million new permanent residents to Canada, Mr. Speaker, including over 120,000 refugees to this country. Mr. Speaker, as I said in my farewell speech to Parliament, and as I will say now in my maiden speech in this Assembly, Canada, according to the McGill historian and former NDP candidate Desmond Morton, Canada has been built, quotes, by the losers of history. Now that's an odd thing to say, perhaps. It doesn't really feel right to think of ourselves that way. But let me develop what Professor Morton meant in his essay on Canada as the country built by the losers of history. If you think about our history, our First Nations peoples who came to this often inhospitable environment tens of thousands of years ago, built communities in this place, but who, at the time of European contact, lost a great deal. and who suffered many indignities and injustices, too numerous to recount. Those Aboriginal people were, in some sense, the losers of history. The French Canadians, les Canadiens français de la Nouvelle-France, ont été les perdeurs de l'histoire. The new French Canadians who lost the French colony in 1759 at the conquest were, in a real sense, losers of history. And they were shortly followed by the United Empire Loyalists, who effectively founded English Canada. And I'm proud to call some of my ancestors in their number. Those United Empire Loyalists were the losers, literally, of the American Revolution, Mr. Speaker. They were loyal to this crown under which we serve, and they were willing to risk and lose all to maintain that fidelity to the institutions that we represent here. They came north. They came to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, to Ontario, to Lower Canada as well, Upper and Lower Canada. And they essentially founded English Canada. But they were then followed by, and they were, Mr. Speaker, let's be clear, they were refugees. They were refugees that had everything taken from them and had to start plowing virgin soil with nothing but a small land grant, living through the first years of terrible deprivation with a high rate of mortality. These were the people that founded English Canada. And then the Highland Clearance Scots, whose parents and grandparents had lost in the Jacobite uprisings and lost their small farms with the Highland clearances of the 18th century, one of whose descendants was Sir John A. Macdonald, the great father of our country. Those Highland Clearance Scots that populated Cape Breton and other parts of Canada, whose descendants have moved west to Alberta, they too were losers of history. Mid-19th century, the Irish famine emigres, Mr. Speaker, when a third of the population of Ireland, between 1847 and 1854, died in the famine. A third emigrated. A third survived and stayed in Ireland. Of the third that emigrated, tens and tens of thousands came to Canada. And I'm proud to say that I am one of their descendants. My family name came to this country in a coffin ship. I believe my great-grandmother is buried in the mass graves at the quarantine station of Gros Isle in the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. These were tough people, Mr. Speaker. They were the losers of history, and they helped to found Canada. Their descendants find themselves, so many of them, here in Alberta. By the way, as members can see, I'm pleased to report that the Kenney family has since recovered from the famine. Mr. Speaker, one could go on to the Mennonites, who fled pogroms and persecution in Ukraine and Russia where they've been persecuted in Western Europe before that, who came west and think of all sorts of communities in Alberta, from Lacrete to Tabor and everywhere in between, populated by those hardworking Mennonites, descendants of refugees. Or the European Jews who escaped the pogroms before the Second World War, many of whom came from Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, from the steppes of Europe, to become merchants in small towns in Alberta. Think of the remarkable Chinese laborers, the bachelor laborers who were brought over here to build the Canadian Pacific Railroad with a high rate of mortality, often exploited, and yet, even though Canada wouldn't give them full citizenship, they still believed in the promise of this country. They planned and built their futures here. They spread out across every little town in the Canadian prairies, all throughout Alberta. And they started their small businesses, their restaurants, and their laundromats, and their motels. And And many of those families are still there 120 years later. In some sense, they were originally losers of history too. You could think, of course, about the European Jewish refugees who came after the war. Canada is a great shame that we essentially had a none is too many policy, refusing the admission of European Jewish refugees during the Holocaust. But perhaps in some small way redeemed ourselves by accepting the third largest number of European Jewish refugees after the Shoah, and many of them I know, friends of mine, now in their 80s and 90s, who are amongst those survivors, losers of history. One can think of the Hungarians of 1956, the anti-Soviet, the anti-communist uprising. One example, the entire forestry faculty of the University in Budapest was basically airlifted to Vancouver, became the faculty at the University of British Columbia, and much of the forestry expertise in Alberta came from those individuals, losers of history, who lost their homes, lost their freedom. The Czech refugees of 1968, right on down till today. Mr. Speaker, I can think of one man who I helped to come to Canada, named Liu Decheng. Liu was at the Tiananmen Square protests in June of 1989 in Beijing. And he was arrested and thrown into a Laogai forced labor camp and tortured for the better part of a decade before escaping. Managed to get to Thailand. Members of the pro-democracy movement contacted me, and I helped Liu to start his new life here in Canada. And so, right down to the Middle Eastern refugees who have come here, many of them victims of the genocide of Daesh and other terrorist organizations. Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry for the long aside on our history, but it's important to remember who we are. The people that founded this province, the Ukrainians who left often political oppression and hopelessness in their homeland to cross a vast ocean and then cross an enormous continent, then to plow virgin soil and live in mud huts for their first 2 or 3 years in a place with no stores, no supplies, no lumber. These people were heroes. We stand on the shoulders of such heroes. Yeah. You think of the Americans who came up from scrub farms in the American northern Midwest, and settled much of southern Alberta. Think of the people, like the family of my friend from Drumheller Stettler, who got through the Depression and the drought in the special areas in the 1930s, when there was often nothing to eat but dust. These were tough people, resilient people. They did not give up. It didn't matter what nature threw at them or chance. I mean, Mr. Speaker, these are the people that built this province. And here's my point. If we were to apply the current fashion of identity politics, of the politics of resentment, to the history of all of these people, we would imagine that we are just a warring, a squabbling series of factions, all with their historical grievances, all wanting to settle scores, all animated by bitterness and a desire to right history's wrongs. But no, instead, all of these people, Mr. Speaker, decided to focus on the future. Yes, to be proud about those who had gone before and the sacrifices that they had made. Never to forget those things, including some terrible injustices, but never to become embittered or encumbered by those things. But rather, they chose together to build a great country in the vision of Thomas D'Arcy McGee, the great martyr of Confederation, Mr. Speaker, who himself started as a Fenian rebel, animated by bitterness towards the crown under which we serve. And yet he came to accept that in Canada, we were building something remarkable in human history. We were building a place of fresh starts and new beginnings, a place where it was possible to leave our ancient grievances outside of this country and to build it together, united in our diversity. In so doing, we, the descendants of these great people, have become the winners of history, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
So that, I believe, is why, that's why I am a proponent of a certain Canadian exceptionalism. I do believe there is something exceptional in the character of this country and particularly this province, which takes all of those experiences and then adds to it like a special entrepreneurial drive and work ethic. And that's what I love so much about this province. In fact, when I myself, as a 22-year-old, I had a good salaried job offer with to go down and be a political staffer in Ottawa. And then, at the same time, an offer to come up here and help start an organization, more or less, from scratch, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation in Alberta, the Alberta Association of Taxpayers at the time in 1991. And for some reason, maybe just because I was young and foolish, but that idea of starting something, of not knowing where your next paycheck would come from, of putting it all on the line, that appealed to me. And that is the draw of Alberta. That is why we have been, all through our history, a magnet for risk takers and entrepreneurs and hard workers and wealth creators. And it's that belief in the creative power of human freedom. Mr. Speaker, it is no coincidence that as we enter those doors to this assembly, over them is written this province's motto, Fortis et Liber, strong and free. Words beautifully taken from our national anthem. Words that themselves perfectly reflect what I call this Canadian tradition of ordered liberty, strong and free. This, I believe, is the only province in Canada which includes freedom in its motto. And it's no coincidence, Mr. Speaker. The land of big skies, of endless opportunity, where dreams can come true. That is the province of which we all are custodians. And so I rededicate myself to that Alberta project of being a sign of hope for people all around the world. Let me share with you, Mr. Speaker, a remarkable and true story, an Irish story. It would have been 2012, I believe, when I was Minister of Citizenship and Immigration. Members will recall that one of the most significant challenges in our economy at the time was that of labor shortages, as our economy was supercharged at the time. We had effectively full employment. Boy, wouldn't it be nice to have those days again? Mm-hmm. But employers were desperate for, and the number one request I was getting in Alberta as a federal immigration minister was, we need more workers. Yeah. And so I went to Ireland to attend and participate in something called the Working Abroad Expo. And I went there with several dozen Canadian employers, and Edmonton Economic Development, Calgary Economic Development, and so forth. In fact, I think Alberta Health Services was there trying to recruit nurses. And there were employers from Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere. And at that time, Ireland and Europe were still going through their financial crisis. In fact, I think unemployment in Ireland at the time was 20%. It was 40% youth unemployment. And that was like much of that through parts of Europe. I will never forget it. 9 a.m., as they opened the doors for the Jobs Expo, there were over 10,000 young Irish and other Europeans and people from actually all around the world that went around several city blocks. And on that misty Irish morning, I worked my way down that queue and tried to shake every hand. Spent 4 or 5 hours going down that line because, Mr. Speaker, my formal agenda was to encourage them to come to Canada. but I must confess I had a hidden agenda. It was to get them to come to Alberta. And as I went down the queue, I saw in the faces of so many of these young people who had been unemployed for 2 or 3 years, a look of hopelessness and despair, which sadly has been too much of Ireland's history. And I would say to them, so which of the countries that are represented here do you think you might be interested in going to? And I was pretty pleased that about half of them said Canada. About half of them. We were beating Australia with their beaches and their warm weather. That was pretty cool. And then for those who said Canada, I went a little deeper. I said, now, do you know which part of Canada you might be interested in? And Mr. Speaker, it sends a shiver up my spine to think of it every time. Again and again and again, that morning I heard from those young Irish and others the same word, Alberta. Alberta. Alberta, they said this, people who had no relatives here, had never visited here, had no friends, would be hard-placed to find it on a map. But the word Alberta represented for these young people hope, opportunity, and a new beginning. This is not just a random place on a map. It is not a haphazard collection of people. It is an idea that has the power to animate hope amongst the hopeless halfway around the world. That is Alberta, Mr. Speaker, and that is why we all serve this province. So, having said that we do have this special, exceptional, Canada is exceptional. I believe in world history for the reasons I've described, and I believe Alberta is exceptional within Canada for those reasons. So, Mr. Speaker, what then motivates me personally in my public service? I'd like to cite words I offered when I began our Unite Alberta campaign on July 6, 2016. I talked about those newcomers who had come from every corner of the earth and to a land where dreams come true. And I said, that's what drew me to devote my life to public service. A passion constantly to renew Canada's promise as a land of opportunity, so that every one of us, especially those who are least fortunate, can realize their God-given potential. The greatness of Canada and of Alberta is not an accident of history. Every day, people join our family, having left behind countries seized by corruption, poverty, and tyranny. Why, then, are we different? Why are we considered a model to the world in so many ways? It is not because, as Justin Trudeau claims, that we are, quotes, a post-national state with, quotes, no core identity. It is not because we are simply a reflection of the world, or as Yann Martel, the novelist, said, Hotel Canada. It is because we are the inheritors of a great tradition of ordered liberty based on the dignity of the human person, the inalienable dignity of the human person, incarnated in certain institutions and customs, like the rule of law, limited parliamentary government, and the sanctity of property and contract. From these have come the brilliant achievements of free markets, free enterprise, and democratic capitalism, of innovation and prosperity, all of which have harnessed human freedom to lift countless women and men out of poverty and despair to realize the greatness of their potential. I say these things because I want to start at the beginning. Far too often in politics, we forget what we are about. We lose track of the first principles that animate us. So I say to you, these are my first principles. I am a conservative because I believe we have an obligation to transmit and renew these traditions of ordered liberty that have helped to make Canada the envy of the world. Now, Mr. Speaker, with that as a statement of my philosophy about our country, province, and politics, let me then turn to more current challenges which we all face. And I preface this by reiterating my respect for members of all parties, including the government. It's important to offer this condition, Mr. Speaker, because I do not want my criticism of the policies of the government to be taken as an ad hominem personal criticism of the people who make up the government. And insofar as the Honourable the Premier is my opposite in this chamber, I would like the record to be clear about my highest esteem and respect for our Premier. When she has been sometimes viciously attacked in social media and elsewhere, I have tried to remind people that we do not have an obligation to agree with our head of government, but she is our elected head of government. And we do have an obligation to respect her mandate and to respect her office and to respect her personally. And that, Mr. Speaker, applies to every minister of the Executive Council and every member of this Legislative Assembly. And so to reiterate what I said earlier about civility, I hope to be able to disagree without being disagreeable, for the differences to be predicated on policy and not people. And having said that, Mr. Speaker, I am very conscious of this. It is my constitutional role as Leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition to hold the government to account and to prepare an alternative government to the Lieutenant Governor should circumstances warrant it. That is a burden, a constitutional convention that falls on the Leader of the Opposition and the official opposition. And I'm serious about discharging that. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, let me just begin with this section of my remarks. That is why I and so many others have worked so hard over the past 21 months to create one united, competent, credible alternative to the current government. 20 months ago, when we launched this campaign, this Unite Alberta campaign, we had two Conservative parties in Alberta. The Progressive Conservative Party, with its great legacy of having helped to build modern Alberta, with inspired leaders like the great modern Alberta statesman, the late Peter Lougheed, like the great Ralph Klein, a man of the people. And I know friends opposite didn't agree with Premier Klein's many of his policies, but I think very few Albertans could deny that Ralph, as we all love to call him, had a passion for the little guy and an innate sense of the common sense of common people. Mr. Speaker, so much of modern Alberta developed through these and other leaders. They weren't perfect. Those governments made mistakes, and that's why we're in the opposition, Mr. Speaker. Some of those mistakes that were made in some recent years. And some of those mistakes were also why we ended up with a division in the Conservative movement in this province. This is no secret. So we had two ostensibly Conservative parties, the Progressive Conservatives and the Wild Rose Party, which itself incarnated important Alberta values, a belief in fiscal responsibility, in democratic reform, and while in its relatively brief existence, some members of the Wild Rose Party made mistakes as well. Fundamentally, I believe the members of both parties were animated by a love for this province and a desire to serve her. But unfortunately, the members of these two parties were locked in a war of attrition, much of it animated by bitterness and resentments that had developed over a decade of division. And it was not only my observation, Mr. Speaker, but others, that as long as this war of attrition continued, we would be creating the potential conditions for a re-election of the current government. I respect the 40% of the popular vote won by the New Democrat Party in the May 2015 election, and the majority of members elected to this place as a result. I point out, however, that the combined vote of the Progressive, Conservative, and Wild Rose parties in the same election was over 50% of the vote. And my view was, the view of so many of us, was that whatever differences those parties had between themselves paled in comparison to the differences that we shared with the New Democrat Party. And so it was our view that we had to find a way to overcome these differences, to heal the wounds, to start again, and to give a new beginning to democratic conservative politics in Alberta. And so we went through a huge amount of heavy lifting. And at first, the Progressive Conservative Party decided in its leadership election just over a year ago to get on the path to unity. I want to thank the former members of the PC caucus who are in this United Conservative caucus for their leadership. It wasn't an easy or obvious thing to do. And they deserve great credit for being ahead of the parade, Mr. Speaker. And then we negotiated a unity agreement. It was hard work. You need only ask these two gentlemen, Mr. Speaker. I appointed the official opposition whip, the member for Calgary-Hayes, as my primary representative on the negotiating committee. And our House leader, the member for Sundre Rimbey Rocky Mountain House, was one of the principal Wild Rose representatives. And look at them getting along here right now. The very picture of unity.
Feel the love.
And someday I will perhaps join with them in writing the history of what happened in those difficult negotiations. It was not a sure-run thing, Mr. Speaker, by any means. A couple of times this thing was stuck in a ditch. And as one Prairie politician once said, you don't shout whoa when you're stuck in a mud hole. So, and that wasn't Strankman, and that wasn't the member for Drumheller either. So, Mr. Speaker, we got it done. We got the unity agreement done, and then we presented it to the members in a democratic exercise. This was not a top-down elitist contrivance. It was an authentic reflection of a democratic will.
That's right.
And we all had the courage to put it all on the line. Again, the outcome was not certain, and yet I am pleased to say 95% of the members of both of our legacy parties said yes to unity. They said yes to the future. They decided to focus on the future rather than getting stuck in the past. And they said that our province is more important than any political party. And we did it. So thank you to my colleagues, and through them to the 120,000 members that make up this, the newest political party in Canada. And with that novelty comes a great deal of opportunity, but also concomitant responsibility. And that's why I have emphasized with all of our party's members the importance of raising to that level. We will begin doing some of this important democratic work at a founding convention in the first weekend of May at Red Deer, where our members will have their say on the initial policy direction of our party, and so much other work to be done. But, Mr. Speaker, this is an important, I wanted to address this in my maiden speech because what we have done together is to make history. And every day, honorable colleagues, we continue to make history together. And so let us never forget the lessons of the decade of division and what it has cost Alberta. And let us rededicate ourselves to the mission of renewing this province as that beacon of hope and opportunity and renewing the Alberta advantage. So let me then turn to those imminent challenges, Mr. Speaker. Our province has recently gone through the longest and deepest recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And that was a doozy. This province went bankrupt effectively in 1934. Mr. Speaker, Albertans are still suffering the consequences of this long and deep recession, at the height of which over 200,000 Albertans were unemployed. We had a 9% unemployment rate. We had gone from consistently the lowest unemployment rate in Canada to the highest outside of Atlantic Canada. We saw near record levels of business bankruptcies and insolvencies. We saw tens of thousands of people leave the labor force altogether, just giving up looking for work, and tens of thousands of others who left the province. We had 7 straight quarters of net out-migration, with more Canadians leaving Alberta than coming to it. And, Mr. Speaker, in the last 20 months, as I've put 140,000 kilometers on my pickup, going to over 900 events, everywhere from High Level to Milk River and Many Berries to Rocky Mountain House. How many times have I been in Rocky? About 6 times?
6 to 7 times.
To the member for Medicine Hat, I think it's about 12 times I've been in the Hat. Mr. Speaker, as I've gotten around and just listened to Albertans, as I've done that, and by the way, Winston Churchill reminded us that moral courage consists not just in speaking out, but in also humbly listening. We've done a lot of humbly listening in the last 18 months. And as I've done that, I have been moved again and again by the stories of despair being experienced by our fellow Albertans. I'll never forget I was going around in the Drumheller-Stettler constituency, 3 events one day, and there was a couple who followed me to each of the 3 events. They spent the whole day driving around listening to my speeches again and again. I wouldn't have done that for my speeches, I assure you. And at the end of it, the third event, I went up to them, and they were kind of shy, and they were standing at the back, and they were frankly looking like they'd been through a bitter times, you know. Kind of reminded me of one of those Johnny Cash songs, Mr. Speaker. They looked like they'd lived through one of those tough country music songs. And I went up to one of them, and I went up to the husband and wife. I said, why are you following me around all day? And the wife broke down in tears. She said, well, Mr. Kenney, my husband was in the construction industry, and he lost his job. And it was through his job that we were able to pay the bills to keep the farm going. But when we lost that income, we lost the farm. And now we're living on a trailer on our son's acreage. And we're in our late 50s, and we've lost everything. And we feel like we have to start all over again, like we're in our 20s. And we're embarrassed to be dependent on our son. Wow. Breaking down in tears in front of me. And they just said, we just want to know that there's some hope that we're going to turn this thing around. I think of the lady who approached me after a speech I gave in Calgary, who, again, she came up to me, and this happened a lot, just broke down emotionally, and she said, Mr. Kenney, 6 months ago I lost my job. I've been looking for work ever since, without any luck. The company moved to the States that I worked for here. They moved to the States, and they said this government's policies were part of the reason why. And she said, I finally, just to put food on the table for my family, had to take the same job I was doing when I was 18, an entry-level retail job. And I just feel ashamed and embarrassed. Broke down in tears in front of me. Or I think of the young man, many of my colleagues have heard this story. I was filling up my gas tank at the Esso station in Hardisty. Who's riding this Hardisty? In Battle River, Wainwright. Yes. And you know the Esso station there. And Mr. Speaker, I'm filling up, and as a young man pulls up behind me in his pickup, he jumps out, seemed to recognize me. He says, "Are you that Kenney guy?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "How long before you replace this government?" I said, "Well, hopefully 3 years." He said, "That's not fast enough." I said, "Buddy, I'm going as fast as I can, but we don't decide when the election is." He says, "But sir, you have to understand, this really matters. My dad lost his job 2 years ago and he can't find any other work. And he's getting depressed now. I've never seen him like this before. And then the young fellow goes on to say, and sir, I'm just 17, and I'm now the only paycheck for Dad and Mom and all 4 of my brothers and sisters, and the pressure and the stress is getting to me too. And this young man starts to break down in front of me. Now, I think we all know that young man. Some of us may have been that young man or a young woman like him. And we know that at any normal time in our history, a 17-year-old oil field worker like that would be working hard and playing hard. He wouldn't know, he couldn't pick me out of a police lineup, and he probably wouldn't know what government is doing. But Mr. Speaker, all of a sudden, this young man understood that politics has real-life consequences for him and his family. And he wants to do something about it. These are the Albertans that I have met. And when they hear the government say, happy days are here again, it's all fine, there's some great recovery going on, it doesn't relate to their real lived experience, Mr. Speaker. We still have 175,000 unemployed Albertans. And 40,000 who have left the labor market, stopped looking for work. And, Mr. Speaker, many of those who are technically working, and I mean, this is supported by the data, it's not my opinion, many of those who are technically working are working part-time, piecemeal, and contract work where they were in full-time, secure, high-paying, often 6-figure jobs. And they're having a hard time making ends. I just met such a fellow in Drayton Valley the other day. Nice young, I think 28-year-old oil field worker. And he's working in Saskatchewan because there's no work for him here. He says, maybe I can get a day or two, but at least in Saskatchewan I can get regular work. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, it's not just workers who have left the province. Why are they leaving the province? Why do we have 9% unemployment in Calgary, the the highest of any city in the country? It is in part because tens of billions of dollars of capital have fled this province. Now, the government tells us every day that this happened simply because we are the passive victims of global commodity prices. We can't do anything to help. It's just, you know, we have to surrender in the face of global commodity fluctuations. Nonsense, Mr. Speaker. Our province has been through cycles and downturns before, but at least in the past we had governments that were trying to maintain and restore investor confidence rather than undermine and destroy it, as has happened in the past 3 years. Mr. Speaker, over $36 billion has been taken out of Alberta's oil and gas sector alone in the past 2 years, redeployed to the same industry, oil and gas, in other parts of the world at the same global prices. It is not about price. Through most of our history, like right now, global prices are $62, our effective export price to the US, $35. Those price points are high compared to most of our history. The Klein government balanced the budget at $20 and then $10 oil, Mr. Speaker. And through most of our history, we've had lower prices than this, but tens of billions of dollars have been relocated from, take for example, one of the major, I think it was Exxon, that took billions out of the oil sands and then redeployed that capital to the former Soviet Socialist Republic of Kazakhstan, one of the most corrupt economies in the world. What's wrong with this? Picture Total, the French oil giant, divested themselves of a multi-billion-dollar oil sands development, and then they redeployed that capital months later to gas fields in the Islamic Republic of Iran, a theocratic dictatorship that stones women accused of adultery and hangs gay men, Mr. Speaker. Is the world better off? You know what that means? That decision means that some guy, probably with a PhD, sitting in the Total headquarters in Paris, did a global risk assessment and determined that Iran was a lower risk for Total's capital than the province of Alberta.
Unbelievable.
This is what's happened to this province, Mr. Speaker. Every day. You know, drilling activity up dramatically in Alberta while it was down and then flat here in Alberta. It was up in Saskatchewan, pardon me, while down in Alberta. You know, the oil field is booming in the Bakken in North Dakota. in Colorado, in the Permian Basin in West Texas. Every day, talented Alberta, we have this incredible brain drain. And why is all of this happening? Well, it's not obviously about the same oil prices, the same gas prices. It's about policy. Alberta has fallen from being the 14th to the 44th most competitive jurisdiction in North America for upstream oil and gas investment. And it's just beginning. Now, why? Because this government decided to pour fuel on the flames of a recession rather than trying to douse the flames. Mr. Speaker, we found ourselves in a hole of the recession, and the first thing you do is you stop digging when you're in a hole, but they dug deeper. They raised taxes on everything, higher income taxes, higher business taxes, higher property taxes, provincial share property taxes, higher. They're helping Mr. Trudeau, their close ally. They just can't say no to Justin, Mr. Speaker. They've never met a Trudeau policy they didn't love. So when the Liberal Prime Minister, who's polling at 11% in Alberta right now, half of where his father was during the NEP, the NDP may not have figured it out, but Albertans sure have, that Justin Trudeau does not have our best interests at heart.
Hear, hear.
When Justin Trudeau said, I want to raise the CPP payroll tax to make it more expensive to hire people and create jobs, the NDP government said, oh, sure, yeah, okay. Then they imposed the largest tax increase in Alberta history, the multi-billion-dollar job-killing carbon tax, which they did not mention to Albertans in the last election. I keep it here on my desk every day. Mr. Speaker, it's the NDP platform. Leadership that matters. Leadership for what matters. Page 24, balancing the books. Balancing the books. Yeah, that was supposed to be this year, Mr. Speaker, $25 million surplus. Whoops, they were only off by $9 billion. That's 16,000%, is that right?
364%.
364-fold, yeah.
60-fold, yeah. It's a lot.
Mr. Speaker, I read this, like I almost read it every day, because I think I'm missing something. There's 7 tax changes mentioned, not one mention of a carbon tax or a carbon levy or a save the planet tax or whatever they're calling it now. 0. It was the biggest misrepresentation, mistruth, I'm looking for a parliamentary word, in Alberta political history. They imposed it 5 months later, and they pretended, oh, we had never really thought about it. It was just kind of, it was a new idea. And then they raised it by 50% on January the 1st. And then Justin Trudeau comes along and says, yeah, I don't like your $30 tax. I want it to be 50. You should go 67% higher. Now, in any normal time in Alberta history, an Alberta Premier would have said, hold on a second, Prime Minister. We're going through a tough time here. We got a couple 100,000 unemployed people. There's a total failure of investor confidence. Oh, you know, incomes are down and unemployment is up. No, Prime Minister, I'm sorry. A normal Alberta Premier would have said, no, we're going to fight you on this. What did they say? They said, absolutely. We'll happily implement your 67% increase in the carbon tax. And then the Premier goes on, because I've quoted her before, saying they're open to raising it beyond that. And we all know, I said this the other day on the speech on last week on the budget. We all know what it's about. Mr. Speaker, New Democrats, and to give New Democrats their due, they really believe that they're saving the planet by forcing seniors to turn down the heat at home in Alberta when it's 30 below outside. Like they're so driven by that ideological zeal. And we all know where that really leads us to. Where Professor Leach, who wrote their carbon tax, said we need a price of $200 a ton to achieve Paris climate target goals. And Environment Canada says $300 a ton. That's right, yeah. $300 a ton. And that's where they want to go. And this is just incrementalism. Like, who's kidding who? Let's be grown-ups here. See, what's the point, as Andrew Coyne says in today's National Post, of a punitive consumer tax that makes it more expensive for people to consume energy in a big, complex, industrialized, cold northern economy? What's the point? When there's no elasticity, people don't stop driving to work Carbon emissions are up in BC over where they were when they brought in that carbon tax. The Australians repealed their carbon tax because it didn't work, didn't reduce emissions, but it did hurt the economy. He says, what's the point? Go big or go home. Make it $300 a ton or stop hurting our economy. Well, Mr. Speaker, on top of all of that, massive new regulations, increased labor costs. What government raises labor costs by 50% in the middle of a recession when people are losing their jobs?
That's right.
You know, I get a kick out of the NDP talking about evidence-based policy. Well, here's the economic evidence. According to a meta-study of all of the minimum wage increases in Alberta in the past, in Canada in the past 40 years, a 10-point increase in the minimum wage results in average in a 2% reduction in employment for immigrants and youth. Why? Because they're the newest entrants to the labor market, the most marginal in the labor market. So what do you think a 50% increase in the minimum wage results in? Well, according to the Bank of Canada, 60,000 job losses across the country. According to the C.D. Howe Institute, 25,000 job losses in Alberta. Think about how, oh my goodness, when New Democrats get on their moral high horse and pretend they have a monopoly on compassion, and then, because union bosses tell them to, they bring in a policy that, according to the think tanks, will kill 25,000 jobs for immigrants and youth. Where is the compassion for those who lost their jobs, Mr. Speaker? There is none. There's no regard. And the massive new regulations on everything. You know, their economic policy reminds me of how Ronald Reagan used to characterize socialist economics. If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. That's what $1 billion in corporate welfare for hand-picked companies in the energy sector after $35 billion in capital has been pulled out.
That's right.
So, Mr. Speaker, and by the way, an unnecessary royalty review that helped to fuel this investor uncertainty, and it goes on and on. Of course, Mr. Speaker, our concern is not limited to the economy. But look at the fiscal catastrophe in what I think history will record as one of the worst budgets in Alberta history. The NDP was elected. All of the members opposite went to Albertans and said, vote for us and we'll give you a $25 million surplus in the 2018-19 fiscal year, this fiscal year. And we'll only increase the debt by about $11 billion. That was the contract with Alberta voters in 2015. And instead, Mr. Speaker, a $9 billion deficit. Wow. And a plan for another $40 billion in debt. Altogether, they promised $11 billion in debt, but we're going to end up with a debt of $96 billion, nearly $100 billion, based on absurdly optimistic projections. Mortgaging the future, as I said in the budget speech, spending $4 billion in interest payments, already at $2 billion, more than 19 of the 23 government departments. I asked the Premier today, does she think that spending $17 billion in interest payments in the next 4 years is a good use of public money? And she couldn't even bring herself to say no. How far these Alberta New Democrats have strayed from the great tradition of Tommy Douglas, who, for all of his policy mistakes, balanced Saskatchewan's budget 17 times. Wow. Because as a intellectually honest social democrat, Tommy understood that when you borrow money, you gotta pay it back. And to who? The bankers. And where? Bankers in Toronto and in London and in Zurich and in New York. Tommy understood there's no social justice in enriching bankers, and that it therefore requires discipline, a discipline this government is completely incapable of demonstrating. But not only is this a fiscal train wreck, Mr. Speaker, but we are profoundly concerned about the government's direction on so many other issues, including, for example, education, Mr. Speaker. Albertans want to ensure we have a quality education system that focuses on the transmission of critical knowledge and skills to young people to help ensure their success. What Albertans don't want is failed pedagogical fads or political agendas in the classroom. And so, Mr. Speaker, we are deeply concerned, and as well, about the NDP unleashing their AstroTurf front groups to attack Alberta's wonderful tradition of school choice. Oh, we hear all these speeches about diversity, but they are ideologically, it's NDP policy, hasn't yet become government policy, but NDP policy is opposition to diversity in education. They don't believe in pluralism in education. They believe in monism, only one way, government, cookie-cutter schools, whereas we believe that every child is unique, that families have different values, and they have a right, as reflected in Article 26C of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They have a prior right to choose the form of education that their children will receive. Well, we will defend that universal human right against the NDP's allies, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, it will fall to us in the year ahead to present a compelling alternative to the economic disaster and the fiscal train wreck of this ill-prepared government. And we will do so deliberately and democratically. Some of our critics say, well, why don't you have a platform, an alternative budget, and so forth. Mr. Speaker, we're not going to make up, like the NDP did in their platform, we're not going to make stuff up on the back of a cocktail napkin. We are going to consult our own grassroots membership with a deliberate debate to set the basic policy direction of our party. And then we will consult broadly amongst Albertans of all backgrounds and walks of life to produce a comprehensive, positive, compelling, realistic and affordable plan, blueprint, to reignite our economy, restore investor confidence, and renew the Alberta advantage. I can, however, tell you that I think we have a consensus on some elements of that plan. It is our intention, Mr. Speaker, that should we be honored with the confidence of Albertans in the election scheduled for next spring, to call an extraordinary summer session of this Assembly. So I forewarn colleagues who are running for re-election to book off no summer holidays next summer.
In 2019.
No summer, okay? Maybe you get Canada Day off and that's it. And should we have this opportunity to come to this place, we will begin systematically to repeal every damaging element of the NDP's economic agenda, beginning with Bill number 1, the Carbon Tax Repeal Act. We will put that job killer through the shredder, Mr. Speaker, within weeks, if we should be honored with the confidence of Albertans. Mr. Speaker, we will repeal the legislation, the damaging aspects of Bill 6 that has imposed massive costs on our farmers and agribusinesses and agri-food operators. Mr. Speaker, we will repeal the regulations and the new laws imposed by this government as part of an endless accretion of higher costs on the entrepreneurial sector of Alberta's economy. We will move to demonstrate fiscal responsibility. It's interesting, the NDP was saying last fall that I have a secret agenda, they claimed, to cut government spending by 20%. Now, today, the Premier is saying I have a secret agenda to freeze government spending at 0 cuts. Boy, that's quite a shift. But last week, her communications director, her spokesperson, said that that the only way to balance Alberta's budget was, quotes, to blow up every school and hospital. So to Albertans who are watching this, Mr. Speaker, that's a preview of the election to come. As this government runs out of time, becomes increasingly desperate, we can expect the volume of that hyperbolic anger to reach decibel-breaking levels. But, Mr. Speaker, Albertans aren't going to rise to that bait. Albertans are too smart. They understand that we can exercise some reasonable fiscal discipline in the provincial government that spends more than any other in per capita terms by far. We are the most inefficient provincial government in Canada by a country mile. And this is not simply the fault of the NDP. Recent PC governments must share a part of the responsibility for that. So, Mr. Speaker, we will demonstrate that commitment to fiscal responsibility. We will demonstrate an immediate commitment to lifting off of the wealth creators in our society the enormous accretion of job-killing regulations. We will eliminate that huge, massive new tax burden of the carbon tax. And we will do everything to send a message all across Canada and around the world that Alberta is open for business again. And that this, once again, is that land of opportunity. And why do we do this, Mr. Speaker? And I'll close with this. We do this not because there's some great, unique virtue just in having balanced budgets or allowing people to keep more of their own money. We do this, Mr. Speaker, because we understand that wealth cannot be redistributed unless that wealth is being created through people's hard work in the first place. That in order for us to have the means to be a generous society with proper funding for critical social programs like healthcare and education, we need that wealth to be generated in the first place. The NDP raised taxes on incomes and businesses but saw revenues go down. So we need to reignite the creative power of this economy so that we have those resources and so that we are not wasting billions of tax dollars year after year enriching bank holders rather than investing in the future of this province. And so the blueprint that we present, our vision of the renewal of the Alberta Advantage, is designed not to achieve some abstract economic goal. What drives us, what motivates us, is a passion to ensure true equality of opportunity for every member of Alberta society, especially those who live at the margins, especially those who have many disadvantages, for persons with disabilities who want to get into the workforce, for single moms who need that opportunity that they desire, for First Nations people who too often are excluded from prosperity in our economy, for low-income seniors who are having a hard time paying the bills as they go up with the carbon tax and the cost of heating their homes. For all of those who are at the margins, what we will present is a vision, a credible plan of opportunity. Once again, to restore Alberta as a province that is the beating heart of enterprise in Canada, the job creation engine of this country's economy. That Alberta that animated those young people in Ireland I met 5 years ago to see this as the land of fresh starts and new beginnings. That Alberta that is, in the word of our province's motto, strong and free.